Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the subtle shift in the room's energy. What began as a lighthearted remark from my wife about my lack of handyman skills quickly snowballed into something else. I chuckled at first, thinking it was harmless, but she wasn't finished. "You should have seen him last week trying to hang a shelf," she said, laughing. "It was like watching a toddler with building blocks." Her mother laughed first, followed by her brother, and soon the whole table joined in. I forced a smile, wondering if I was overreacting. Maybe it was just playful teasing, but then she kept piling on. "And don't even get me started on how he handles stress," she continued. "Remember when he had to call my dad to help change a flat tire?" The laughter grew louder, sharper. My jaw clenched, but I stayed silent. I didn't want to cause a scene in front of her family. I focused on my plate, feeling my face flush. I glanced at her, hoping she'd notice my discomfort, that she'd realize she'd crossed a line. But she was enjoying the attention. Then her brother added, shaking his head, "Man, I don't know how you managed to marry her. You're lucky she doesn't have higher standards." The laughter that followed wasn't just at my expense. It felt like a direct hit. This wasn't funny anymore. It felt like an attack. And as if to seal the deal, my wife leaned in with a smug grin. "Oh, come on. We all know he's not exactly a real man." Silence fell. The only sound was the clinking of silverware against plates. My stomach twisted, and my hands curled into fists under the table. A real man. I could have laughed it off like usual, played along, but something in her tone, the ease, the confidence, the assumption everyone agreed, hit me differently this time. I wasn't angry in a loud way. This was something colder, deeper. I looked around the table, seeing their amused faces, their enjoyment of my embarrassment. Then I looked at her. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even looking at me because to her, this was normal. I swallowed the urge to speak up, to defend myself, to demand respect. But I knew something she didn't. This would be the last time she humiliated me like that. The drive home felt suffocating. She was on her phone, scrolling as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just torn me down in front of her entire family. The car was filled with the occasional buzz of her phone and the steady hum of the tires on the road. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles whitening under the pressure. Her words echoed in my mind. Not a real man. I wanted to confront her, to ask her what that even meant. I wanted to know if she had any idea what it felt like to sit there, vulnerable and ridiculed, while her family laughed like I was some mistake she regretted marrying. But I stayed quiet. So did she. And that silence told me everything I needed to know. When we pulled into the driveway, she finally looked up from her phone. "Are you seriously upset about that?" she asked, her tone laced with irritation, like I was the one being unreasonable. I exhaled slowly, trying to stay calm. "Did you even hear yourself tonight?" She rolled her eyes. "Oh my God, you're so sensitive. It was just a joke." "A joke?" I let the words hang in the air, heavy with meaning. "A joke," I repeated, my voice steady and quiet. "So when you said I'm not a real man, that was just for laughs? You didn't mean it?" She sighed dramatically, as if the conversation bored her. "You take everything so seriously. My family jokes like that all the time. It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal." I nodded slowly, more to myself than to her, because now I understood. This wasn't about one dinner. It wasn't an offhand comment. This was how she saw me, how she'd always seen me. And she wasn't sorry. She didn't even care. I stepped out of the car without another word, closing the door softly behind me. She stayed inside, probably expecting me to shake it off like I always did. But this time was different. I walked into the house without waiting for her, the door clicking shut with a finality that echoed in the silence. She lingered in the car, likely scrolling through her phone, assuming I'd move past it. But I wouldn't. I stood in the dim hallway for a moment, taking in the house we had shared, or at least the house I thought we had built together. Everything felt different now. The photos on the walls, the furniture we picked out, even the faint scent of her perfume in the air. It all felt foreign, like I was a stranger in my own life. I took a deep breath and walked toward the bedroom. The front door finally opened behind me, her footsteps echoing on the floor. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. She went straight to the bathroom, and the sound of running water filled the empty space. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, my thoughts shifted from what had happened to what I needed to do next. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to beg for respect. I was done playing that part. So I made a decision. I didn't slam doors. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even tell her I was making a choice. I simply stopped trying. The change wasn't sudden or dramatic. I didn't wake up the next morning as a different person. I just let go. I stopped initiating conversations. If she wanted to talk, that was her move. If she didn't, I wasn't going to chase her. I stopped making plans for us. If she wanted to spend time together, she could put in the effort. If not, I wasn't going to beg for her attention. I turned my focus inward, something I hadn't done in a long time. I started going to the gym regularly, not for her approval, but because I wanted to feel stronger. I poured time into personal projects, picking up hobbies I had long neglected. I stopped waiting for her to notice me, and slowly, I realized something. I had spent so much energy trying to be good enough for her that I never stopped to question if she was good enough for me. Now I had my answer, and I didn't like it. At first, she didn't seem to notice, or maybe she did, and assumed I'd eventually revert to my old ways. Days passed, then weeks. I remained quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence she was used to. This wasn't a silent treatment. It wasn't a game to make her come running back. It was something else. I had checked out. She continued her routine as if nothing had changed. Waking up, scrolling through her phone, making coffee, leaving for work without acknowledging me. Normally, I'd be the one to bridge the gap, to fill the silence with conversation or small gestures to win back her attention. Not this time. I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to make a point. I just didn't care anymore. And that's when she started to notice. It began quietly. She started asking when I'd be home, something she'd never cared about before. Then came the offhand remarks about how much time I spent at the gym, the late nights at work, or just not being around like I used to be. One evening, as I grabbed my keys to head out, she muttered, "You've been kind of distant lately." I simply shrugged and threw on my coat. "Just busy," I said, but she wasn't convinced. I could see it in her expression. I wasn't behaving like the man she was used to guiding. I wasn't chasing after her, reaching out, or putting in the effort, and that threw her off balance. Then, the subtle jabs began. "You've been hitting the gym a lot. Trying to impress someone?" Or, "Wow, you actually have plans? That's a surprise." She was prodding, waiting for a reaction, wanting me to argue back, to show some sign that I still cared enough to play along. But I didn't take the bait. That cut deeper than any argument ever could. One night, she shifted her approach. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, some random TV show playing in the background while my mind drifted elsewhere. She slid closer, placed her hand gently on my arm, the first touch in weeks. I didn't pull away, but I didn't acknowledge it either. "It feels like there's something wrong between us," she whispered, her voice softer than I'd heard in a long time. "Don't you think?" I finally met her gaze, something I hadn't done in what felt like forever. Was something wrong? No. She was just now realizing the emptiness I'd been feeling for months. I let the silence stretch before finally replying, "Yeah," in a flat tone. She waited, expecting me to elaborate, to offer a solution, to promise to make things right, like I always had. But I stayed quiet. That's when she understood I wasn't trying to fix things anymore. After that, she began watching me more intently. I felt it. Her eyes followed me when I walked by. She'd glance at my phone whenever it buzzed on the table. This version of me, the one who didn't scramble to mend things, who didn't crave her attention, was unfamiliar to her. The more I pulled away, the more desperate she became to pull me back. She started asking questions she'd never bothered with before. "Where are you headed? Who are you meeting up with? Why are you out so late?" There was a sharpness to her words, not out of care, not jealousy, but fear. Fear of losing the control she once held so effortlessly over me. But I had nothing to conceal. I answered when I felt like it, gave a shrug when I didn't. My world no longer revolved around her approval, and for the first time, she was the one feeling unsettled. Then came the family dinner, just like the others before it. But I wasn't the same man. She probably assumed enough time had passed, that I'd let everything go. She laughed at some inside joke with her brother, touched my arm like she used to, trying to reel me back in. But I wasn't playing along. I was physically present, but my mind was elsewhere. Her family, the same people who had mocked me weeks ago, noticed the difference. "You're awfully quiet tonight," her mother remarked. I gave a polite smile, took a sip of my drink. "Not much to say." My wife let out a forced laugh. "He's just been really serious lately." She looked at me, waiting for a joke, some sign that everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine, and I wasn't pretending otherwise. Her brother saw an opportunity and smirked. "Still trying to figure out how to be a real man, or did you finally crack the code?" The old me would have laughed it off, tried to prove myself, made an effort to fit in. The new me just held his gaze, long enough for him to realize I wasn't part of their game anymore. His smirk faded. That was enough for me. I didn't need to argue. I wasn't going to fight for respect that was never coming. My silence said everything, and this time, they felt it. The dinner continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. My wife fidgeted, uncomfortable with the new dynamic. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. For once, she was the one off balance, and I had never felt more grounded. I didn't belong there anymore. The drive home was quiet, but not like before. She wasn't glued to her phone, pretending things were normal. She stared straight ahead, her fingers tapping nervously against her leg. The tension was thick, but I let it settle. I pulled into the driveway, parked, and stepped out without a word. I heard her footsteps close behind me, her heels striking the pavement quicker than usual. As soon as the door closed behind us, she snapped, "What the hell was that?" I turned to face her, meeting her eyes for the first time that night. "What was what?" she scoffed, crossing her arms. "Oh, don't play dumb. You know exactly what I mean. You sat there all night like you didn't even know anyone at the table." I tilted my head slightly. Was I supposed to? Her jaw tightened. "Are you seriously still upset about that stupid joke? That was weeks ago." I let out a slow breath. There it was again. She still didn't get it. "This isn't about the joke," I said calmly. "It's about finally seeing things for what they really are." She let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, please, do enlighten me." I didn't flinch. I wasn't here to argue or make her understand. That part of me was gone. "I spent years trying," I said plainly. "Trying to be enough for you. Trying to prove myself. Trying to fit into whatever version of a man you and your family think I should be." Her arms fell to her sides. "And now you're just done?" I nodded. "Yeah, I am." For a moment she was silent. Then she shook her head, letting out an exasperated breath. "You're being ridiculous." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. "Keep telling yourself that," I said, brushing past her toward the bedroom. I grabbed a bag from the closet and started tossing clothes into it. She followed, her voice rising. "Oh, so that's it? You're just leaving? Just like that?" I zipped the bag shut. "Yeah, just like that." She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Right. So what? You think you're punishing me? You think I'm going to beg you to stay?" I turned to her one last time. "No, I think you'll do what you always do. Pretend you don't care. Pretend you're better off. And maybe you are." I slung the bag over my shoulder, stepping past her. "But so am I." I walked out without a second glance. No yelling, no dramatic farewell. She didn't deserve that kind of ending. I don't remember how long I drove that night. I wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't running from anything either. I drove without a destination, the windows down, allowing the crisp air to brush against my skin. With each passing mile, the weight I had borne for years began to lift, fragment by fragment. I didn't feel broken. I didn't feel lost. I felt free. Eventually, I arrived at a small, unassuming motel on the town's edge. There was nothing special about it, but for that night, it was mine alone. I let my bag fall to the floor, sat at the edge of the bed, and simply inhaled. No tension clutching my chest. No doubts creeping into my mind. No one beside me, waiting for apologies I no longer felt compelled to give. For the longest time, I had believed that leaving would signify failure, that regret would swallow me whole, that I'd miss her presence. But I didn't. What I truly missed was myself, the version of me that wasn't constantly striving to prove something, chasing after an identity that was never mine to claim. The version that understood I deserved more. That night, I slept more peacefully than I had in years. The weeks that followed passed in quiet tranquility. No angry messages lighting up my screen. No emotional phone calls breaking the silence. She never asked me to come back, and I never anticipated she would. Pride had always been her shield. But deep down, I knew she felt it. The emptiness left behind by the man who had contorted himself for years to meet her expectations. And I felt the return of someone I had ignored for far too long. Myself. I moved into a space of my own. It wasn't extravagant or fancy, but it was mine. I focused inward, on my work, on the things that genuinely brought me contentment. I didn't rush into another relationship or seek to fill the void she left behind, because in reality there was no void. She had only ever occupied the parts of me that doubted my worth. And now, that doubt was gone. I never contacted her again. I never had to. Life moved forward, and so did I. Still, every now and then, I wonder if she sits alone in that house, scrolling through her phone, finally realizing that she never broke me. She had only set me free. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you. Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. The night unfolded much like countless others in recent times. William found himself slouched on the couch, his eyes fixated on the flickering television screen, which he had muted. The whiskey in his hand had grown warm, but he lacked the energy to drink it. His gaze wandered aimlessly from the fireplace to the window before finally resting on his phone, untouched on the coffee table. Victoria had been behaving differently for a while now. At first, William dismissed her odd behavior as a fleeting phase, blaming the pressures of life for diverting her attention. But now, the signs were undeniable. The late nights, the constant checking of her phone, the hidden messages, and the distant smile when her phone buzzed. All of these clues had piled up to form a picture he could no longer ignore. Something was different tonight. He could sense a palpable tension in the air. Victoria's aloofness had grown more pronounced. Earlier, she had mentioned catching up with old work friends. Yet, the hesitation in her voice and the way her fingers lingered on the door handle for just a moment too long sent a chill down William's spine. He thought back to their recent conversation about a new colleague, Charles. She had described Charles as a charming and well-regarded new addition to her team. Initially, William had brushed it off, thinking their 14-year relationship, built on trust and companionship, could weather any storm. But now, things felt different. When she came home last week, the way she spoke about Charles's successful work event carried an unusual enthusiasm. Her eyes sparkled in a way that felt out of place. Victoria, who seldom indulged in office gossip, was suddenly full of praise for Charles. William had nodded along, but a seed of doubt began to grow within him. That night, she wore a dress he had given her years ago, but this time, it seemed like it was meant for someone else, for Charles. He tried to push the thought away, clinging to the trust they had built, but the accumulating evidence was hard to dismiss. Tonight, William was certain that something was amiss. Hours later, the front door creaked open quietly, and Victoria stepped inside. She took off her coat, her eyes meeting his briefly. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. She wore a new perfume, one that was unfamiliar and unsettling. "Still awake?" she asked, her tone overly casual and strained. "Couldn't sleep," William replied, though his mind was racing. He watched her closely as she hung up her coat, his heart pounding. Her smile seemed forced, a mask she was hiding behind. "How was your evening?" William inquired, keeping his voice steady. "It was fun," she answered, her eyes darting to her phone. "Charles was there. We all had a good time." Her words felt rehearsed, her tone too practiced. William's eyes narrowed. Mentioning Charles again ignited a flash of suspicion. "Why didn't you invite him over tonight?" he asked, pretending to be lighthearted. "He's a nice guy, right?" Victoria hesitated. "He had to leave early. He's really busy," she shrugged. William stood up, setting his glass down with a sharp clink. "Odd," he said, struggling to contain his anger. "You've mentioned him so often, yet now he's too busy to meet me." Victoria's expression shifted to irritation and disbelief. "You're being ridiculous, William. Charles is just a friend. You're overreacting." But William felt a knot tightening in his stomach. His thoughts raced, tangled and messy, but one clear conclusion emerged. She was hiding something. Before he could respond, she grabbed her purse and headed for the door. "I'll be back later. Don't wait up," she called out. William stood still, the quiet click of the door echoing in the room, leaving him in silence. He moved to the window, peering into the night. Victoria slid into Charles's car, her laughter piercing the stillness. Charles didn't even glance back at the house. William's fists clenched as the realization hit him. She had chosen Charles. The betrayal was sharp, but something cold and calculating began to form within him. She had no idea what she had set in motion. The night dragged on, and morning arrived too soon. When Victoria returned, the dawn's light barely illuminated the room. William stood, his heart pounding. "What happened last night?" he asked, his voice low but filled with menace. Victoria hesitated. "It was just a fun night with friends," she mumbled. "No." William stepped closer, his eyes icy. "You left with Charles without a word. What about me?" Her voice wavered. "William, please. It's not what you think." He laughed bitterly. "Isn't it? Tell me what I'm not seeing." His voice cut through the tension. In that moment, William knew. He had lost her. She was slipping away, indifferent to the pain she caused. He spoke quietly, but his words carried a finality. "You've made your choice. Now, it's time I make mine." She shook her head forcefully. "William, I've told you before, there's nothing going on between Charles and me. You're blowing this out of proportion." William's eyes locked onto hers, cold and unyielding. "I know exactly what's happening. There's no need for explanations. I've seen everything." He paused, watching the color drain from her face. "Did you really think you could carry on without any consequences?" Victoria recoiled as though she'd been struck. "William, what are you suggesting? What do you plan to do?" she asked, her voice quivering. William's smile was frigid. "I think you already know." Without another word, he turned sharply and left the room, leaving Victoria standing there, pale and breathless. For a moment, she remained frozen, then moved toward the door, reaching for her phone. But William's voice halted her in her tracks. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he called over his shoulder. "Your options are diminishing by the second." Victoria spun around, her face a mix of fear and frustration. "What are you even talking about?" she demanded. William didn't answer. He was already walking toward his study, where old files and documents waited. His thoughts were razor-sharp as he reflected on the events leading to this moment. There was no turning back. The plan was already in motion, and the pieces were falling perfectly into place. As William sifted through the documents, his hand rested on a stack of financial papers. His smile darkened. You want to play games, Victoria? He muttered to himself. Let's see how you handle this one. Across the room, Victoria's phone buzzed. Her fingers hesitated above it, but she couldn't resist. She picked it up and read the message from Charles. Can't wait to see you tonight. Everything's going as planned. I'll pick you up after work. Victoria's heart pounded. The casual, intimate tone of the message struck her like a slap. She glanced at William, who was busy in his study, his back turned to her. She was alone, but for the first time in months, the weight of her decisions loomed over her like an inescapable storm. Meanwhile, William meticulously worked on finalizing the details of his plan. He had always been methodical, a trait that had never wavered. His life was built on control, ensuring he was never caught off guard. The situation with Victoria had shaken him, but it had also brought clarity. He moved swiftly, completing the last of the financial maneuvers he'd arranged with the bank earlier that day. The final transfer was straightforward. A few clicks, and it was done. Victoria had always left financial matters to him, trusting him to manage their life. Now William was about to return the favor in the most ruthless way possible. When he re-entered the living room, Victoria was still standing in the same spot, clutching her phone, her hands trembling slightly. Her face was ghostly. Her lips were pressed into a tight line, clearly searching for a way to salvage what remained of their relationship. But William's decision was firm. "Are you thinking about leaving?" William asked casually, though his words carried a weight that made her flinch. Victoria opened her mouth to speak, but her voice cracked. "William, please, I don't know what to say. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I should never have let it get this far." William's gaze hardened. "It's too late for apologies now, Victoria. The damage is done. But don't worry. You'll get what you deserve. Let's see how well Charles copes when everything he's worked for is suddenly gone." Victoria blinked, startled by the abrupt shift in tone. "What are you talking about?" she asked. William leaned in, his eyes dark and unforgiving. "I know everything, Victoria. The affair, the lies, the betrayal. But you haven't just betrayed me. You've put yourself in a position where I can take everything from you. The house, the car, the money you've been spending on your little escapades with Charles, it's all gone now." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. "What have you done?" she whispered. William stood tall, his words crashing down on her like a tidal wave. "I made sure you'll never forget this. Your accounts, empty. Your credit cards, maxed out. The house is already in foreclosure, and I've contacted Charles's workplace. He'll be hearing from HR in the morning about how he's violated company policies." Her face turned white as she staggered backward. "William, please, you can't do this." But William didn't waver. "You should have thought of that before you started all of this. I gave you every chance to fix it, but you chose him over me." He turned away, his voice growing colder. "Now you'll live with the consequences." Victoria felt her legs give way, collapsing onto the couch. Her mind was spinning, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she tried to process what was happening. The life she had taken for granted was unraveling, with no escape in sight. William stood there, watching her, his face unreadable. He felt no pity, no remorse. He had anticipated this moment. The realization that Victoria had chosen someone else, that she had betrayed him, had prepared him for this, and now the price was being paid. "Get out," he finally said, breaking the silence. "I'm done." Victoria's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't move. She couldn't bring herself to leave. She had nowhere to go. The finality of William's words crushed her. She had lost everything. The man who had once loved her, the life they had built, the stability she had depended on for years. William watched her a moment longer before turning and walking out of the room. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Later that night, as Victoria sat in the empty house, her phone buzzed again. It was a bank alert. She opened it quickly, her hands trembling, Her account was empty. Her savings were gone. The mortgage payments were overdue. Frantically, she checked her other accounts, but they were the same. No money, no home, no way to fix the damage. That's when she realized the full extent of William's revenge. He had taken everything, every shred of security she had left. In the days that followed, the consequences of her actions became heavier. The car was repossessed. The utilities were shut off. The once vibrant house now stood dark and silent, mirroring the emptiness inside her. She tried calling Charles, but he didn't answer. Her few remaining friends turned away, unwilling to get involved. She was alone, with no way to undo the destruction she had caused. William, meanwhile, had vanished without a trace. He seized the chance to rebuild his life, free from the burden of a failed marriage. He moved on, creating a new life she could never be part of. And Victoria was left to confront the wreckage of her choices, haunted by the realization that she had lost everything she cared about because she chose someone else. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.